So a lot of you may not remember this, but a while ago I had a debate with anarcho-capitalist Kal Molinet, who is a perfectly nice and reasonable guy, except for the fact that he's an ANCAP. I enjoyed this debate tremendously, however, there were some things said during it that I felt like I had to follow up on, because they sounded like, you know, bullshit. So I have some notes, and it took me a while to get through them all, and to look all of this up, and to read through The Prince again, meaning that I listened to the audiobook because I couldn't find my copy anymore. But here I will be going, and you know, it's maybe better if you watch the debate first that we had. I'm gonna link it in the description, but it should be fine like this because I will be sort of explaining the arguments that he was making. But if you just want to be sure that I'm not strawmanning him right now, you possibly should go see the debate. I tried to go about this chronologically, so it's probably chronological in the way that these things came up in the debate. The first point was that of fire departments, because obviously we are in a world where the fire department comes to your house and then puts out the fire. And the theory is that in an anarcho-capitalist world, the fire department would come to your house and then say, hey, pay us $1 million or we're not going to put your fire out. To which Kal Molinet said that fire departments are already completely run by volunteers and donations. Well, it turns out that that is just factually untrue. Fire departments are run by volunteers, most firemen are volunteers. They do get a salary in most situations, but all of the funding comes from the government with fire department grants. They also receive donations because obviously that's a thing that you could donate to. The vast majority of fire department funds is the government. The second thing that came up was the Charlie Gard case, which he didn't mention him by name. He just said that there was this child that was brain dead and his parents wanted an experimental treatment, but the police wouldn't let them, and there was a cordon of police officers armed, ready to shoot the parents like as fucking some sheriff in rural Texas if they even tried to get this. Charlie Gard suffered from a thing called MDDS, which is a degenerative disease that affects your mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of your cell. And if you imagine the powerhouses of your cell not working properly, you can make out what might happen, which is that everything fails. All of this was in England, and the doctors of the pediatric hospital that Charlie Gard was in all agreed that he had absolutely no chances of recovering from this disease, as is the standard. So what they would do, according to guidelines, is deactivate life support for that child if it was going to die anyway in the very near future, to prevent it from suffering more. And so there was this doctor in New York who said, hey, I have a treatment for this disease, for MDDS. It's experimental, I have no idea if it's going to work, but we could at least try, which is something that happens in extremely dire situations. You can qualify for experimental treatments. And the Child's Hospital in England said, yes, we're going to try it. And the NHS even offered to pay for it, even though in America, where you have private insurers, they do not pay for experimental treatments. And then the doctors and the US doctor, eventually looking at the full data of the child and the whole diagnosis, decided that even this treatment had such a small chance of doing anything at all that it was really not worth trying, especially considering that doing this treatment, applying this treatment to the child, would have made it suffer immensely. The US doctor actually described the chances of this having any effect at all as being vanishingly small, which is not really a term the doctors throw around lightly. And even if the treatment had been a full success, the child would have been essentially brain dead for the rest of his life and could have never been able to live like a normal person, and would also have suffered for the rest of his life. Completely understandably, the parents weren't happy with this. I mean, this is after all their child that the doctors are saying has no chance of surviving. And they thought that they knew better than all the doctors. So they organized a massive social media campaign and a hate mob and went through this incredibly long court proceeding, which of course they would. I don't fault them for that. I feel like that is something that a parent would do. It's just objectively they were incorrect, and the court upheld this. We don't let parents beat their kids, and we shouldn't let parents have their kids suffer when their suffering could just as easily be taken away. There is a big debate about medical ethics to be had here, but the situation where this is the government deciding that a child would die, that if otherwise would have been healthy, is nonsense. Even the American doctor said that he would defer to the people who are in charge of the child's treatment as to whether or not he would administer the treatment. And these people decided that they would not administer the treatment. And thus, the child would have never been administered the treatment anyway. At no point were there any cordons of armed police officers who were ready to shoot the parents the moment they brought the child over the border to save it. The third point that came up was that Kal claimed that there was a state-enforced limit on how many medical licenses can be handed out in the US and the UK. And this simply isn't true. There is no such thing. There is no limit on the amount of medical licenses that can be handed out. No hard limit, no soft limit, no de facto limit. The only limit on the amount of medical licenses that can be handed out is the amount of people that are actually qualified to be real doctors. The only mechanism that limits the availability of doctors is doctors having to be good at being doctors. The next point that he made is that the public school system is shit because 80% of New York high school graduates were illiterate, meaning incapable of reading. This seemed patently absurd to me, but he said, no, Google it. You'll find that it's true. And so I did Google it, and I found out that it's not true. 80% of New York high school graduates are not capable of doing some of the basic things required for college, because colleges these days have very high standards, and let's be honest, the way America handles its school system is pretty shit. This is not a problem in any other country, Western country, I should say. It's just that America is bad at school systems. Also, he sort of implied that if there was market competition, then wow, then the schools, it would just be so much better, because then we wouldn't have this problem. There is market competition for schools in the US and also in almost every other Western country. You can have private schools that people can pay for, and then they can have their children go there. And the problem hasn't been remedied. I mean, the whole reason public schools were introduced in the first place is because poor children did not have the money to afford an education. And so to even put them anywhere near equal footing with wealthy children, that is why we introduced this system, to defeat the problems that capitalism implements into education. The fifth point was the USPS, which is indeed in massive amounts of debt. And I don't think this is surprising at all, because obviously it is. Have you ever thought what the service is that the USPS provides? You can literally take a piece of paper and put it in a mailbox in Key West, Florida, and it will arrive in Whittier, Alaska, a completely isolated town that is far away from any form of civilization, within 24 hours. And it costs you not a fortune, but a few cents. To give the opportunity to send mail to all of these very out there and distant towns, operating at a loss is necessary. No private company could and would do what the USPS does, because it simply isn't profitable to connect these people to civilization. Next point was about universities, and it is indeed true that American universities have some of the best in the world. There are amazing universities in the US, which you would expect sort of in a country that has a lot of universities. Kal said that in all the other countries, especially Germany, universities are known to be terrible. That's just not true. It's just factually incorrect. When you look at the global university rankings, you have United States in the first place, United Kingdom in the second place, and then Germany in the third place. It's literally the third best country to get a tertiary education in. By some other ranking systems, that place is not taken by Germany, but by Denmark. The point being that having state-run, state-funded, and regulated universities doesn't really have a significant decrease in quality to having all these private, ultra-rich universities. And really, if you think about it, if you had the option of getting the best of something, but being in debt for the rest of your entire life and having massively crippled your economic opportunities, and instead getting the third best of that very same thing, and not even not having to pay money, but actually getting money from the government so you can do those things, and then you won't be economically crippled for the rest of your life, Which is the smarter decision to make? Which decision do you think will create more entrepreneurs that have the starting capital to actually open businesses? The people who are, after being in college, massively in debt? Or the people who are, after being in college, not massively in debt at all? The next thing that came up were friendly societies, which Kal explained as being a sort of voluntary private insurance scheme where people would pay into a pot for certain insurances, and most of the time these friendly societies would be limited to certain neighborhoods or ethnicities or certain types of labor, and then those would pay out if something went wrong with the individual. And that was proposed as an alternative solution for, healthcare and all that kind of thing, which is provided in most Western countries by the government. And so Kal claimed that the government moved into these friendly societies and annihilated them so they could provide their own Medicare. The thing is that that's bullshit. What they did instead is take these friendly societies, make them official and government bag, and exempt them from income tax. The entirety of the German healthcare system, which also functions where in Germany, if you go to the hospital, somebody will pay your bill, that also functions over a system very similar to friendly societies. Next point was that governments always try to increase themselves and gain power of more areas of life, which also is just historically, if you look at the way things have been going, not true. More and more government-backed institutions are being privatized, and usually when that happens, the quality of the services decreases and the price of these very same services increases. You only have to ask Germans what happened to the Deutsche Bahn after it was privatized in part. Then came the whole thing with feudalism. If you don't know, I am a firm advocate that feudalism is essentially what happens when you have anarcho-capitalism, wherein wealthy dynasties amass a lot of wealth and own all of the property, and then everyone else is forced to be a serf on their property. Essentially, a noble family in one place would be a subsidiary owned by a king in another place. I mean, the reason you couldn't hunt in the forest without a license given to you from your lord during feudalism was because you were infringing on his private property. And the peasants had to create large governments in order to defeat this anarcho-capitalist feudalism. Because the feudal lords were the people with the capital. They could afford the armies, they could afford the castles, they could afford all the good things. And so they could just afford to take money from the people off them, because after all, if you're a farmer, you are using their land, so obviously you would have to pay them for the service, which is essentially how anarcho-capitalists levy taxes just as much as any government would. It's just that those taxes go to private individuals instead of a pool of commonality where it is spent for what is good for everyone. Next thing was a mistake on my part, because I was of the opinion that the Queen of England and the royal family actually receive money from the government, which is true but not in the way that one might think. All money that the royal family receives is, and this comes back to the whole feudalism thing, money that the government pays for leasing properties owned by the royal family. Of course, the royal family leases out these lands that they own, which is, the royal family of the United Kingdom owns a lot of very important land. And they lease it out at below market rates, because essentially they're forced to, and in exchange they get to be head of state. Which, I don't want to shout anarcho-capitalism again, but this is the aftershock of living in an anarcho-capitalist world. Then it comes to the whole issue of stability and empire. The idea in such a feudalist anarcho-capitalist system is still that it is fairly stable. People know what they are getting, and there is not much conflict and not much unnecessary war. It is only when the government, in the form of kings, came and conquered all these feudalist nations that the problems arose. Except the problem is that whole construction just sort of falls apart when you consider who were the people who became the kings above all the other feudalist owners of property? Who were those people who somehow rose and conquered all the other neighboring kingdoms, violating their nap? And how did they gain such a position? Obviously, those people were also feudal lords who just so happened to be in a more advantageous economic position that they could violate every other person's nap and get away with it. There's this whole principle of how if you had a sort of government corporation that would act as both things, if they did things which are atrocious, the board of directors could depose the CEOs, which is a nice notion, but that has been true historically throughout a huge amount of kingdoms and empires, including the German kingdom, where the king was legitimized by the power of the most powerful feudal lords. A great example is Genghis Khan, who could at any point have been deposed by his board of directors, which were the other Khans that were below him, by way of Kurultai. That is how Mongol law worked at the time. However, all of these Khans were making vast amounts of money from a guy that literally killed so many people that you can notice the death of humanity in strata of soil. And this has happened again and again and again. Every great emperor that has conquered and conquered and conquered had some form of board of directors, and if they did not have the nominal power to depose that CEO, they had the de facto power to do it, because you cannot just have a leader that doesn't control any keys to leadership. And again and again and again and again, when other people's naps were being violated, when atrocities were being committed, and when these board members were being enriched by that, they didn't stop the CEO. And if at one point you have an advantageous position and you know what to do with it, and you can have a runaway resource gain, which is what happens when you begin conquering, because you always add more resources to the pool, eventually the power of you becomes so disparate to the power of all the people around you that you are de facto unstoppable. The things which have historically hindered empires were internal mismanagement, which can happen to you in a corporation, and once again, the CEOs of those companies were not deposed historically, or geographical barriers, which is why the Persians couldn't invade the Greeks very well. Furthermore, the Brits actually used corporations in which you could buy shares, and the Dutch did this also, to handle affairs and even administratorial affairs in their colonies, and the results were atrocious atrocities. The next point was when I gave him the last word for the debate, which maybe I shouldn't have done from a perspective of wanting to win the debate, but I really just wanted to exchange some ideas. So I feel that at that point, Kal, as nice as he is, sort of unloaded the rest of the bullshit. And I am now in a position where I can address these things. So according to Kal in The Prince, Machiavelli says that it doesn't really make sense for all the merchant republics and merchant principalities that existed in Italy when Italy was a pre-feudal and feudal nation to actually go to war with each other and employing mercenary armies, because the cost-benefit analysis just isn't there. Now I thought to myself, hang on, I have read The Prince. It says this nowhere in there, but it does say something about mercenaries and cost-benefit, so maybe I should look back into it. And that really is the reason why this response video has been delayed by a long time. Also, there comes the factor that the time of merchant republics and principalities in Italy was one of the most war-heavy and violent periods in human history. So what Machiavelli actually does say about mercenary armies is that you shouldn't use them, not because it's not worth it to conquer your neighbors. He actually says the exact opposite. You should conquer as much as you can. The Prince is literally a book on statecraft where he teaches young princes how to conquer foreign lands and hold them effectively. Machiavelli says that you shouldn't use mercenary armies because they only care about money. You should instead have a private army that is loyal completely to you, and not some mercenary army that you didn't build from the ground up, because they only care about the coin and they will try to fuck you over. Here are some of the things that Machiavelli actually did say, which is a perfect guide for the ultimate anarcho-capitalist. Utterly destroying and colonizing your enemies is cheaper than maintaining an army. You should go to your enemies, you should annihilate everything they have. You shouldn't do it slowly. You should go there, destroy everything so they will eventually forget what happened to them. And then you don't have to maintain an army there because everything they had has been annihilated, and then you offer to help them rebuild so they will become loyal to you. It's also very important to make sure that the natives are somewhat satisfied but do not ever attain a position in which they could challenge your hegemony. Therefore, you should monopolize. You should also always look to the future and see what places could eventually become competition, and either become allies with them and force them to become your inferiors, or just squash them straight up. He also teaches you how to force weaker people to be your allies and to do your bidding and be loyal to you without being able to gain sufficient power to ever contest you. He also said that you should especially destroy the will of people who are accustomed to liberty instead of servitude, because people who are accustomed to liberty are not loyal to the idea of there being someone above them. And liberty will always, even if you've lived 100 years in slavery, result in people revolting against their masters once things don't go so well. It also includes a very long guide on how to keep your subjects just content enough so they don't get mad, and just powerless enough so they can't do anything that you wouldn't want them to. And just to drive this point home, Machiavelli was very in favor of armies. He said that you should have armies, and they should be private armies that you own. Not even armies of your mates and the people who you believe yourself to be allied with. They have to be your own army, and they have to be loyal to you. And also, you need to do war if you want to ever achieve any significant power at all. You should appear to your subjects and to your allies as though you were a good person who cares about their welfare, but you really shouldn't, because it is easier to be feared than loved. It also includes a guide on how to get away with breaking contracts, such as, hypothetically, the nap. And it explicitly tells you that if you ever want any significant power at all, you will need to do evil. So that's just, you know, the perfect guide to becoming a successful person in an anarcho-capitalist state. In the next point, he asserted that because of the free market, people have become richer than medieval kings, and all of these luxury goods have been distributed to them by the market, which is a baseless assertion that we can easily discount by looking at how historically the disparity between the wealthy and the poor in a society has been larger in states where governments did not have at least some measure of control over the market. And also how right now in the United States, the government is abandoning increasingly control over the market, and wealth inequality is skyrocketing to an unprecedented extent. This I responded to at the very end of that, but he also said that the euro is collapsing, probably because of how the governments in European nations control their markets. That's just factually untrue. The euro isn't collapsing. People have been saying that the euro is collapsing for a very, very long time. It hasn't happened. As a matter of fact, the euro is a good bit more valuable than the dollar. And also, this came back to the, well, if democracy, if people democratically decide that they're going to gang rape you, well, then they can gang rape you, which is something that I addressed during the debate several times. He also said that a majority of Muslims right now in the UK are making it so the UK is becoming Muslim, which is just not true, because there is no majority of Muslims in any Western country, not even anything approaching a majority of Muslims. That is a completely different situation that has nothing to do with the functionality of democracy. Anyway, that was just some of the points that were made. I don't think I addressed all of them, because these notes are a bit older. I made all of these months ago. I skimmed over the debate today to really just get a feel of what had been said and reassure myself that I was not misrepresenting the things that Kal did actually say. So if you do want to watch the debate, do go in the comments. Please do not in any way harass or do anything of the sort to Kal. Maybe subscribe to his channel. He actually does have a few interesting things to say. And I do like him as a person. He's a super nice bloke. Thank you very much for watching. Like, subscribe, and do all the things. I have decided, this is very important, that I will no longer be streaming games on Twitch. And the reason for this is it just takes a huge amount of my time out of the day, especially for editing and doing these videos, because I always stream on the same day on which I release videos, and just working on other projects. It's just time that I could invest into more profitable things, because let's be honest, the Twitch streaming doesn't really make me any money. So at some point in the future, I might come back to it. Right now, it's just tedious. I was doing it for a while because it was fun. It's no longer fun. So at some point, I might come back if I feel like it, but there are no more regular streams on Twitch from me for the foreseeable future. In that spirit, make sure your private property isn't annexed by your neighbor who has a bigger gun than you, and see you around, cunts.